Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming down for this session, Beyond Story, a conversation for the industry. My name is Patrick Hurley. I'm the Director of Marketplace and Talent here at Sheffield DocFest. And I'm really thrilled to have this incredible panel, to have this really interesting conversation. And I'm really, really reassured to see that you guys have come down to be part of it as well. Let me briefly give you some context to how we're presenting this, if my slides work. Nope. Okay, great. So I work in the space between filmmakers and the industry, and have noticed for a while that anyone trying to pitch new ideas to get them made into documentaries, a real emphasis on story. DocFest's tagline for the last couple of years has been, "What's your story?" And I noticed last year at the IDFA Forum, a premiere pitching event, right on the catalog was quite a similar tagline, "What's this story?" I had some friends here. This is my mate Heejung, who's a producer from Seoul, who was pitching to the panel a non-narrative film, a film that didn't necessarily have a classic story structure. And what erupted in this pitching moment was a little bit of a conversation within a 7-minute window in which is given for feedback and comments from the panel to really interrogate, is it okay? Where does a film that doesn't necessarily have a narrative or a story sit, and where can it be placed? I was also at this festival with another filmmaker who had a film in DocsFest program in 2017, Brexitania. My friend Tim, who was having a lot of conversations with industry and was pitching another non-narrative film, and his takeaway from IDFA was, "But what happens?" in capital letters, and felt this pressure to kind of explain that. I also noticed that in Mandy's Strand, we have story in the title, and the kind of noticing all that happening, a manifesto was published in February that was brought to my attention from our film programming colleagues, and the manifesto is called Beyond Story, and it's kind of pushing for a conversation between film practitioners, filmmakers, people who are interested in film, as well as the industry. So we have Alisa here on the panel, who's one of the co-authors of this manifesto. We're going to begin with a little video, which was put together by the collective who assembled this, and then I'm going to invite Alisa to comment and make any elaboration on what this conversation is really about, and then invite our panelists here, who I'll very quickly introduce. We have Chris Harris, a senior programmer from Picture House Cinemas. We have Brett Story, a filmmaker who's made non-narrative films before and whose film The Hottest August is in the program and is screening tonight. Mandy Chang, commissioner from BBC Storyville, and Barbara Chumin, head of documentaries from VPRO. So we're going to kind of have a conversation together. I'll invite you guys to input at some point. But Sophie, if we could roll the first clip, the Beyond Story manifesto introduction, that would be great.
We are practitioners and scholars drawn to documentary
because of its potential to intervene in the dominant consensus
of the perceived world. We need documentary.
We need it to help interpret the world.
We use documentary. We use it as artists, as viewers, and as activists.
To help us imagine new ways to engage with the world.
We rely on documentary in all of its eclectic variety to record, trouble, explain, reveal and share lived reality and our plans and hopes to transform it.
As students and teachers of documentary history, we are keen admirers of its tremendous range of expressivity. We know that documentary has many organizing logics suited for specific times and places. Documentary comes in many forms. In times of trouble, we need all of its great range.
Indeed, we are drawn to documentary for its insurrectionary possibilities and its activist and engaged orientations.
Just as and because we resist by using documentary, documentary resists generic and formal categorization. It must be adaptive to be useful, and so form matters.
Documentary form shapes ways of thinking and seeing, just as it emerges from and shapes ideological assumptions. Politics and form are inextricably intertwined.
One does not exist without the other.
Exist without the other.
We're not against story per se. We're against privileging story as the most viable or supported organizing principle for documentary, especially when documentary is poised to liberate itself from its narrative moorings.
We urge filmmakers, funders, programmers, scholars, and viewers to look beyond story and to other forms of documentary, and to ask ourselves why storytelling has become today's preeminent mode for documentary, and really, what gets lost? What gets lost when storied structures prevail? Just when did story become king?
When did story become king? At the very moment when there were profits to maximize.
Forms are cultural, political, and ethical commitments in their own right. We believe there's a social obligation to challenge received forms and to celebrate the process of finding form in the formless and formlessness in the form.
We believe there is a social obligation to challenge received forms and to celebrate the process of finding form in the formless and formlessness in the form.
Cameras film things as they are happening. People experience the world in real time, but also in felt time.
Reality often feels unmoored, confusing, unstorified, especially in crisis.
In other moments, it seems difficult to separate historical reality from the many forms, including story, that have been imposed upon it.
While cinema can provide one remedy for the human need to create causal sense, it can also resist, embellish, complicate, or mirror this lack. For instance, there are documentary forms that run outside of structures of capitalist accumulation, subjective pleasure, ease, or comfort, or even a desire for rational sense.
Documentaries can prioritize spatial, graphic, interactive, atemporal, aesthetic, and abstract associations.
Our manifesto hopes to intervene in a new consensus in the field of documentary. We hope to pry open more of the great potential of documentary at a moment when it feels at risk of being closed down, the very same moment when the world opens out and destabilizes newly in relation to climate, migration, authoritarianism, global corporate media, neo-capital, and other impending catastrophes.
We need forms of documentary that rupture the present self-satisfied state of affairs.
We need forms that do not feed upon or into the colossal denial that allows this state of affairs to continue.
We trust and know that stories will emerge on their own. But if we can expand beyond story as the dominant organizing principle of 21st century documentary, we stand poised to encounter and make use of infinitely open-ended, expansive, and explosive alternatives.
We ask you to join this effort by contributing examples of reality-based meaning-making beyond story that allow documentary to do its best, most arresting work in hard times.
Alisa, here we have the credits as well as the contributors to this video. I encourage you guys to all check out the manifesto in its full text, but one of the co-authors, Alisa, I invite you to elaborate and comment on it.
Can I borrow your mic? Of course. So what we asked people, we reached out to about 25 filmmakers, film scholars, historians, with the draft of the manifesto and said, if any part of this manifesto resonates with you, will you record that part for us? And we're going to make a kind of community farmed video. And so when you see the sections where there are 3 or 4 people speaking at once, those were clearly the sections that resonated the most with people, but we wanted to include, the multiple voices there, kind of choral effect. And so we didn't, this is just extracts really from a longer manifesto, but it was the parts that resonated for the people we were reaching out to. When we wrote the manifesto, it was motivated by, actually, it was out of a conversation that my friend Alex and I had, where it turns out that separated by 2 years, we each gave a keynote at the IDOCS symposium, and apparently we gave the same keynote about how specific to nonlinear documentary and web documentary, that there really didn't need to be this emphasis on story, digital storytelling. And in fact, that may not be the most effective use of this incredible new media. But then we realized that actually that's not the place to start, because interactive documentary came out after this push toward this sort of narrowing of the field of documentary, where funders, commissioning editors, and festivals themselves were really prioritizing, certainly broadcasters, prioritizing this very particular type of storytelling, character-led, almost the heroic individualist story, small stories to tell big themes, et cetera, which actually we're not necessarily against. I mean, initially we called this manifesto against story, and then we thought, we're not against story. We love stories like anyone else, but we are against it becoming the only game in town, really. So we wrote it thinking, well, who knows? We're going to put it out in the world and see if anybody responds to this, or if we're the only crazies who are having trouble here. You probably have even participated in the story mania. I find it rolls off the tongue so easily for people that we are storytellers, that that documentary has to be about story, that the story I'm telling, et cetera. So even when I'm having this kind of intervention conversation with people, it still rolls off everybody's tongue. It's so dominant right now that we can't even think outside of it. And so really all we're asking is to kind of open up the conversation. I was at a panel this morning. I sort of decided to immerse myself in the rhetoric. I went to climate stories that Doc Society put on around documentaries on climate change. And there was an absolute uniform consensus that individual people's stories and experiences are the only way that we're going to affect people. And there was a lot of talk about, obviously, affect, about feelings, about empathy, about people, how do we get behavioral change, et cetera. And I was thinking, how do we get systemic change? Surely not this way. We don't have time for all of those diverse stories anymore. We could tell 1 million of them and nothing will change, but we will all feel a little better having seen them, or maybe a little worse, right? So anyway, I immersed myself in that this morning so that I would really fire myself up and realize this really is the dominant rhetoric of the field, and we need to think otherwise, especially, as we say in the manifesto, in these almost desperate times. So that's my perspective.
Great, thank you. Before we proceed, Alisa, could you just define what we're talking about here for story, so that the rest of the conversation is all talking about the same thing?
Yeah, no, that's a really good idea. And I think anybody who wants to intervene around our use of the term story may have a very good point, right? As I said, we're not against story per se, and there are so many different ways, storytelling traditions, for example. But we're talking about really a dominant narrative tradition of the West that Hollywood actually perfected, and that I think documentary has been infected by, in terms of very specifically character-led, limited narratives within kind of a time frame or space, and telling things through the individual's perspective, right? So that we really tend to lose sight, in a sense, of the bigger picture.
So it's something like a contained cast of characters who have kind of cause and effect logic and something sort of happening rather than.
Exactly. I mean, the conflict is essential. I mean, I've also taught documentary. I know that you need to teach beginning documentary filmmakers that maybe they need to learn something about storytelling, right? But I also understand that documentary's history has done, in documentary history, the classics, the ones we remember, and the ones that maybe have changed perspectives, perceptions, or taught us something, are not necessarily those limited, character-led, cause and effect narratives.
A few examples?
Well, of course I do.
That would be nice.
Yeah.
The ones that are not story-driven that you think
Yeah.
are really important.
Well, I mean, I think, historically, if anybody has seen some of the City Symphony films, Berlin Symphony of a City or Man with a Movie Camera, I mean, Man with a Movie Camera sounds as if it has a simple narrative, but it's actually a very complex film. There are, when I talk about documentary tradition, the essay film, any number of films that we might think of as the essay film, which can be truly profound, observational film, also usually resists a very simple linear narrative. But in the festival today, I mean, this weekend, I watched Nicholas Geierhalter's film Earth. Geierhalter, well, in this one he actually had interviews, a few, but Geierhalter has certainly made a name for himself making films that are not linear or character-driven, not driven by cause and effect logic, and the conflict is a much bigger one that he's treating. There's a film in the festival called Sarah Christensen's film, Swarm Season, which it actually has a logic of beehive, right? A honeycomb logic is how that film is structured. It's a really beautiful film. I highly recommend it. We have Brett Story here, who's filmed Prison in 12 Landscapes, and her new film, The Hottest August, are perfectly good, excellent examples, in fact, of films that refuse that logic and I think, have a much more powerful effect and are much more thoughtful in their intervention. They're doing kind of more concerted work, if I can say that. So, yeah, I mean, I probably could go on with examples, but partially what we've been resisting is making the canon, is writing the canon of the non-story documentary. We wanted to open it up to people's ways of thinking about this, speaking of which, the manifesto asks for contributions online, and I'd like to pass out these postcards. Can I get this person's help to pass out those postcards? Thank you. For people to chime in this conversation of your experience, either, I mean, you can also contest the manifesto in whatever you want to say, but what comes to mind for you? And I would like to hear later whether there are projects that you wish you had funded but didn't fund because, or didn't commission, or didn't work with, or didn't program because of this sort of dominance of story and the conviction that really is the only thing, the only way to reach audiences. I'd like to hear your perspective also. I mean, I'm really excited to hear your perspective.
Yeah, Barbara and Mandy, as commissioning editors on the panel, I'd just like to invite you both to comment and respond in however way you like to the ideas presented thus far.
I'll go first.
Is that working?
Hello. Oh, I should put it on maybe. Hello?
Testing.
Hello? Is it me? Hello? Yeah, now it's working. This manifesto truly irritates me, and I have a bit of an allergic reaction to it, because I think it completely simplifies what a documentary is. And so I'm completely in disagreement of it. And I think I do a lot of essay films, I do a lot of observational films. I think it's very simplistic to say it's all story now, because that's not what we do. What we do is good storytelling. It doesn't have to be story, but good storytelling, that even if you have an essay, you want to get me somewhere. And I think for a TV audience, because I don't work for a cinema audience, I work for a TV audience. And you all watch TV. So what do you do when you watch TV? And especially now, I'm in a little bit of a documentary identity crisis because of it. Because people do not watch TV like they used to, like, oh, there's a good Storyville on, so I'll go and watch it. No, people watch it on their iPads. And they're a lot more subject-driven. than that they just think like, oh, there's a new Storyville out, so I'll watch it. People are very impatient these days in how they consume films. So I can see that they're doing a lot less on television and that it's a lot more subject-driven, and that I need to sort of, for TV, create a language that is a lean-forward experience, because people are too impatient. Look at yourself. If you're at home at night, think, oh, what shall I watch tonight? Shall I do Netflix? Shall I do Amazon? Shall I go and see what's on the BBC player? How do you look for films? How do you look for these non-story films? I mean, there's no way to do that anymore. So I think we should have a conversation about, like, okay, what do you need to tell your story, and is it a good story? Or is it good storytelling? It doesn't have to have a character or a prince that has lots of obstacles but comes out at the end. It doesn't have to be like that. There's plenty of films that are different, but what I do see is that the essay films do a lot less on television now than they used to. And they cost probably, like, I had this film, How to Make a Mermaid, Coco Schreiber, that was at a lot of festivals. It cost $500,000. 50,000 people watched it on television. And then I'm not sure if that's well spent money, because it's such a small audience. And I talked to her, like, could you make a TV version out of this? Because the TV audience is a lot more impatient. And she said, no, I don't want to do this. This is the film I wanted to make. But I thought, but it's funded with TV money for about 75% of your film. At least you should have a sort of cinematic language that has the rhythm of television, because people will just not watch it. And that's actually what I'm saying in my blurb now. I want cinema with the rhythm of television. That's what I want. And that's what I need. I looked for this panel at the 50 films that we funded with the Dutch Film Fund. So these are really cinematic films that have to go out in cinema. And out of the 50 we did in the last 10 years, only 23, so half, turned out to be good television as well. And out of these 23, 11 were made into TV versions. So it's really a different craft. You can't expect a TV audience to have a lean backward experience, because if you go to cinema, you buy the ticket so you watch it, because that's what you're there for. But I need to think of the audience. And of course, I really totally resist a sort of like, it always has to be a hero and a character-driven story. Completely. I'm really irritated by it. Sorry.
But I mean, one of the things, is this working? Yes. One of the things that, I mean, I think Barbara and I are the same in that we're always looking for different and alternative stories and different ways of telling stories and form-busting type of stories. And remember, television, mainstream television, is very risk-averse. And I think just because I looked up the word story, because I think what you're talking about is kind of traditional narratives and the use of characters and kind of, you know, a kind of narrative arc. And there's a kind of a reason why that works, because as storytelling is as old as since man could talk. And the definition actually is, storytelling describes the social and cultural activity of sharing stories, sometimes with improvisation, theatrical, or embellishment. Every culture has its own stories or narratives, and which are shared as a means of entertainment, education, cultural preservation, or instilling moral values. Well, I mean, also kind of, there's many other reasons that we tell stories. But you know, we had an oral tradition, then we had a written tradition, and then technology allowed us to make films where there was audio and visual, and we put them together. And you know, it's interesting just thinking about where kind of innovation of form comes from. And you think of something like Asif Kapadia's work. Barely anyone before he did it took all their voices out of image and just used the voices. And that is really innovative, and it has influenced and inspired, you know, countless filmmakers. And for me, that's radical, because no one was doing it before. They didn't have the courage to do it. And he did it, and it worked brilliantly, because he had all that brilliant archive in Senna and Amy, and I haven't seen his latest film, but I'd like to. And you know, the history of documentary making is full of kind of innovative things. You know, look at Claude Lanzmann making a 9-hour documentary. I mean, we've really kind of concertinaed that into very kind of, you know, 52 minutes or 60 minutes or the feature length. And that's the beauty of Storyville, by the way, that we don't, length doesn't really matter to us. I mean, it can't be 5 minutes, but it can be 80 minutes, it can be 105 minutes. It doesn't, it is what the story can take. And then, you know, Barbara and I both came in on the raft, and that is an incredibly innovative, because it's made by a theatre director, and Marcus Lindeen, and so it has this kind of theatrical quality, and I think that's what Barbara is trying to talk about, the kind of huge diversity of documentary storytelling. And, you know, I'm always looking for those kinds of films. I'm always looking for boundary-pushing films, but they still have to reach an audience. The audience is absolutely key because, you know, and even though we're public service broadcasting, we're not like Netflix where there's a commercial imperative at the bottom of it. So we have a lot more range and scope, I think. We still have budgets, you know, there's still a guy who says, okay, you know, no, if you take him something that's too kind of crazy and out there. And sometimes we're allowed to do crazy and out there stuff. And, you know, there are different places for different forms. Sometimes art galleries, you know, the art form, documentary art forms, or experimental filmmaking. And now the world of VR, which is kind of also really pushing the boundaries of how we tell stories, because it's not linear in the way that we know that linear narrative form. So I don't know what I'm saying, but I think I agree with Barbara that I don't want to make it reductive. I don't want to make the idea of what a documentary and what a story is reductive, and it's really hard to, it's just a useful way of finding a word to describe something that has many, many forms. And I know what you're saying, that character and story is, you know, the narrative forms that we have and the talking heads and the, you know, the way character is driving story. But I also think there are very good reasons for that. And that's not to say I want everything to be traditional and to be the same, because I don't. And, you know, just looking at Brett's film the other night and what that does and how that takes you to other places is a really important way of like looking at ideas and a story differently. And it is going on television, isn't it?
Yes.
So there you go.
I have 3 microphones that don't work. It'd be great if we could fix those.
Do you want mine?
No, I'm just saying.
I'll turn off mine. Maybe that helps. If I can find what.
You look like you're about to juggle.
I know, that's right. But I might use this opportunity to, obviously everyone's going to be able to respond to what's been said so far, but Brett, to invite you to kind of comment on your filmmaking practice and your perspective on what we're talking about.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, wait. Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. You know, I was very excited to have this conversation. I think it's an important conversation, and I feel like I have stakes in this conversation from multiple perspectives. Certainly, as a viewer, I have a certain set of stakes in this conversation, and as a viewer, and I'll be honest, though I won't go on about it. As a viewer that gets very bored with the convention, precisely because it's a convention, precisely because I'll see films and feel like I've seen this over and over and over again. I know what the pitch looks like. I know I don't need to stick around because I know what kind of ending there will be. But I'll speak specifically about my perspective as a filmmaker. So I've been making nonfiction films for 15 years. I've pitched those films many, many times in small meetings and in forums. And the films that I make, I describe them simply as nonfiction, partly because I feel like the term documentary has been so captured by a very sort of specific idea of what a documentary should be, and often as nonlinear. So, which is to say, my films do have characters, or at least they have people who talk, They're about ideas. They're about things that are happening in the world. The film that's playing tonight is a film called The Hottest August, and it's an attempt to gauge the sort of paralysis that people are feeling in the age of climate change anxiety. And it uses the formal conceit of being filmed entirely over the course of 1 month in one city. So it's filmed entirely in August in New York City, and we sort of canvass the city, observing events that are happening and having conversations with people. So it's certainly in its form, and to the degree that it's led by ideas, it doesn't fit the traditional mold of a kind of character-driven, story-based, 3-act structure film. And it was very hard to get support for as a result, as all my films had been. So actually, Mandy was just reminding me that we had met last year at the Hot Docs Forum, where I pitched the film and was very nervous about pitching in front of a broadcast audience in particular. And it went fine as far as a pitch goes, but I mean, 4 or 5 people must have called what I was doing experimental. And you know, I know experimental film and I love experimental film, but I don't make experimental film, I make documentary. And I make documentary that's in the tradition of, I think anyways, of Agnes Varda, of Frederick Wiseman, of the Black Audio Film Collective, which made films that were commissioned by Channel 4. And so I'm interested in sort of my own frustration trying to make a living and trying to make films that I feel passionate about and believe can find audiences. My stake in this conversation comes out of a real sense that even if we want to, you know, believe that there's this openness to myriad forms, actually when I have conversations and when I pitch films and when I try and get funding over and over and over again, there's the risk aversion is the sort of dominant experience, and a sort of absolute unwillingness to believe that an audience would be interested in a film that does not have sort of at most 3 characters that have a journey. And you know, and I hope that, you know, once my films are out and find audiences, that sort of disproves some of that risk aversion. But it's certainly my whole career it's been frustrating to encounter the kind of dominance of this idea of what documentary should be or what audiences want. And you know, the last thing I'll just say is that I think that audiences, you know, don't just want, you know, audiences are more open than I think people think that they are. And you know, I think that in the same way that literature needs to have multiple forms, and the airport novel isn't the only kind of form that can exist in literature, I think, you know, audiences are hungry for new ways of experiencing moving images that encounter the real world.
Brett, your comment on audiences, and which has also been brought up by you guys, it's a nice segue to invite Chris to bring in some comments. Chris, your role as a programmer for Picture House Cinemas, also with a focus on documentary. Would you like to comment on what's been said so far?
I mean, film in terms of risk. I mean, film distribution, any type of film is a risk, particularly, you know, independent foreign language film. You know, some weeks there can be sort of 15 films released into cinemas, all, you know, all vying for audiences' eyes, and sort of it almost sort of feels more risky even for documentary in a way, and I'd say certainly for the bulk of the cinema audience, you know, there's a lot of people out there who probably think that, you know, a documentary is something that you watch on TV rather than in the cinema. So sort of the odds can be sort of stacked against documentary success in the cinema from the beginning in some ways. I mean, it's probably sort of best to talk about documentaries in the cinema sort of within, you know, in sort of comparison to kind of independent and foreign language films. For a foreign language film on release in the cinema in the UK, you know, the Holy Grail is a box office of £1 million plus. You know, it's the sort of the kind of figure that perhaps a Pedro Almodovar film hits, whenever it's released or whatever, or anywhere sort of around the sort of 600, 700,000 pounds, box office would be considered a success for those type of films, possibly a bit less in terms of documentary, really. I mean, I think over the last 12 months in UK cinemas, there have been probably 5-6 documentaries that have achieved over £300,000 at the box office. So I'd say going back to McQueen, which took 660,000, Whitney, which took about 450,000, but actually, the scale of the release of that film was very much based on the success of Amy. So £450,000 for Whitney is actually probably considered a bit of a failure for a film that was expected to take over $1 million at the box office. Although compared to a lot of other documentaries, 450 is a pretty good figure, but certainly a lot more was spent on it. They Shall Not Grow Old by Peter Jackson, which was certainly very much an event-led release around the satellite Q&A with Peter Jackson afterwards. Then we had Three Identical Strangers, which released in November. That took 450, and was for about 2 weeks Dogwolf's biggest release in cinemas until they released Free Solo, which is the giant of the last 12 months. It's up to sort of 2 million in the box office now, which is incredible. And then most recently, Amazing Grace, which an amazing film, amazing lost archive film, which is up to about £650,000 in the box office now, which is incredible. There's a sort of a running, I guess the running theme there is that they're all either sort of big famous people or archive films for the most part. I guess with the exception of Three Identical Strangers, which I don't know, perhaps sort of fits into what you're saying in terms of sort of just sort of a classical cinema narrative in a way, really. It's I guess what I'm trying to say is that those are I wonder in a way if I'm sort of proving that cinema in terms of sort of the big releases of cinema documentaries is perhaps risk averse in a way. It's
Are you risk averse?
I don't think so. We show. I'm only sort of listing the bigger examples. I think we do certainly try within our programming to show a sort of a real range of documentaries of different types of films. I think sort of one of the ones I liked the most last year was Time Trial, about the final few months of the cyclist David Miller's career, and I just thought it was sort of so refreshing for a sports documentary. And I think, inherently, I think the audience are going to see it, are probably keen cyclists and know of David Miller as a personality within cycling, but the film itself is, it's a really cinematic film. It's very sort of impressionistic, really. It's kind of a film that's sort of trying to, in terms of its reputation, is sort of just trying to sort of give you an idea of what it's like to be a pro cyclist who's coming to the end of his 20-year career, rather than just having David Miller on screen, telling you what that's like. And that's, a great film, a film that the producers of the film essentially have backed their own release and released that film, and I think it's done about £75,000 at the box office, which compared to those other 5 that I've talked about sounds very small, but that's a real success. It's a real sort of grassroots release. That did very well. I guess Agnes Varda's film last year, Faces Places. You mentioned sort of Agnes Varda. I love one of the sort of most beautiful films of last year, sort of all round, really, and it's. It definitely, I would say, sort of surprisingly struggled at the box office a little bit, actually. It sort of took about £130,000. Definitely.
That's one that did well on television as well, but because Agnes Varda has a very good vision and voice, and I think that's why it did well on TV and in cinema, actually.
I guess what I'm saying is we were hoping for more than it took, really. It was released in September last year. It came off the back of, it sort of felt like about 2 months of an Agnes Varda season at various cinemas around the country. It kind of, I don't know, I mean, it kind of wasn't helped that it was sort of released the same week as the MIA documentary, which was also a really good film from last year, and they probably sort of split their audience, really. They both sort of took a similar amount. I don't know. Yeah, it's tough out there.
I want to ask a question. What do we think it would take to bring audiences? Because everything you've talked about is the classic narrative documentary, strong or famous characters. And where do ideas come from that break with form? And what would it take, from your perspective, to change the paradigm?
You're asking me.
I'm asking you.
See, I actually think it's a question for all of you, for the people who are not just the decision makers, but literally the gatekeepers. I mean, the makers are trying to make their work, and some are succeeding in making their work. Getting it out there seems to be a different question altogether. But I actually think that the people who know the answer to that, or who might be able to come up with the answer to that, are
So
in your
from my
position.
perspective, I'm always pushing, but also we have audiences. We now have really sophisticated analytics around that stuff. Who comes to them, whether they're working class, middle class, what kind of income bracket they're in, whether they're BAME audiences or, we can get really, really good statistics about who comes to these films and what the range is, what the age range is. It's quite incredible. And so, we have a certain obligation as public service broadcasters because our audience pays for us, to give them what they want. And within that, I think I can say the same for Barbara, because I know the kinds of things that she commissions. We're pushing all the time because we want the diversity of storytelling.
I even said to my channel manager, because he wants me to do half the film's prime time, said I'm fine with that, but then in the evening at 11, I want to go wild. Then you need to give me a place where, otherwise it will be just 50 Shades of Grey. So I need to have a place where I can have filmmakers experiment in different ways of storytelling, and even if it's a brilliant failure, it's fine.
Well, yeah,
and we have that, and we do have that space, but at the same time, I'm not making it for the filmmaker and their friends and their family. It needs to have an audience.
No, of course, but failure in terms of box office doesn't necessarily make a failure, right?
No. So failure I try to do a film, like for example, I'm working with a filmmaker now. It's very exciting. He's a young filmmaker who did a film called Independent Boy. I don't know if you've seen it. And he's doing a film now about his father died when he was 23. And it had a really big effect on his life. And he wanted to do a film about if something like that happens to a young person, how does it affect your life? So he asked a girl who went through the same experience, what are the 7 key moments in your life that you had with your father who died as well, or with yourself when he died? What are the 7 key moments, and can we replay them with actors that are playing your father and your mother? So these 7 key moments, they're doing it now. So the girl told us what these stories were. The actors got her backstory, but it's documentary because it's all about how do they improvise, how do they tell her story. And it's a very scary thing because we don't know if it's going to turn up into a good film or if it's just sort of drama therapy. But it's an interesting idea to sort of push the boundaries of fiction, documentary. How do you perceive things? I don't know. We'll see.
Go ahead, Brett.
Well, I was just going to say, I find, what's interesting for me already about this conversation is that, the 2 sort of metrics that have been mentioned, and they are metrics, are box office profits and then sort of viewing numbers. And I think that the part of the, the impetus of the manifesto, what I get out of the manifesto is a resistance to the reduction of value to those terms. I mean, those films that you mentioned, you're right, they are, the majority of them are about celebrities. It's not just that they're, individual heroic stories, but you have to make a film about Amy Winehouse to be a successful filmmaker in this world. Like, that's a problem. I think it's a problem. It's certainly a problem for filmmakers, and it's a problem for audiences. And I just want to say, what's amazing about public television is that it isn't beholden to commercials. And there's a history of public television in England, in Canada, where I live, in the United States, taking the most risks precisely because it's funded by taxpayer dollars and not by commercial interests, and that's wonderful. And if I wanted to, I don't listen to top 40 radio stations because the music that everybody likes is often, I'm not just being a snob to say some of it is not good. I'm saying that, I know, okay, that's a bit snobby to say, but it's true. Like, there's got to be room for other kinds of music than the music you hear on the top 40 radio station, and I want the same for my cinema.
Yeah, I'm not talking about audiences and numbers. What I'm talking about is impact and who within those audiences are being reached. So, and I know that Storyville reaches all these parts of the audience that don't get access by other parts of the BBC. They do in some cases, but I know that what we do is different because I can see that, compared to all the other stuff on BBC4, we're reaching a much bigger youth audience, we're reaching a much bigger BAME audience. Often working class people watch our shows and they don't necessarily do that with other things, but it is a channel for older people, which is why we're going to a channel with younger people, a younger audience as well, because we want to reach both.
I only care about audience numbers if they're prime time, and if it's late night, I don't care.
Well, there is something to, there's something to creating other spaces, and that they don't need to be prime time, and they don't need to be major theatrical releases. There really do need to be other ways of thinking about what some have called the event, right, of the screening, right? And it doesn't have to be always about reaching millions in a particular way, but it can be more targeted. There can be multiple ways, or it can be at a different hour. I think that is one of the things that would really change the landscape, is that if there were more outlets, more ways of thinking about getting the work out there, including just off prime time, which used to exist a lot more than it does now. But I think, what I hoped that this session...
But even then, so that it's less late night shows, but you can watch a lot more online. But if you look at what people watch online, it's very subject driven. It's very hard to get to, online everyone can watch it, so why shouldn't they? Because they're swiping and they're thinking, is this one for me? Nee, I don't like the picture, no, I don't like the title. It's really weird. That's where my identity crisis now for documentaries. Apart from that, I'm absolutely fine. But I'm 50, so maybe midlife crisis, but that's also fine. But it's more about, like, how do you reach this audience? Because you can, Werner Herzog says, like, you can make a film for 10K and you can put it out in the world and everybody can watch it. So if an audience really wants to see it, they can find it. But I don't see how they find it. I don't see it anymore. That's where I find it difficult. So if you have a solution, please tell me.
This is not about solutions. Everybody got their postcard. This is about really sort of trying to bring in the wisdom of the people making and doing and programming and commissioning to see how we can do better. What I was going to say is I was hoping the session wouldn't turn into, the camps and people who are in positions of commissioning or programming to basically affirm already what they're doing well, which they are doing well. You are doing well. But I'm trying to think about how do we open up to other forms? And one of the questions I wanted to pose was, are there projects that you wish you could have backed, or that you weren't able to back, or that you did back, and got you such cold feet that you can't do it again. What will it take for our people in these positions to begin to take risks again? Because I actually think that the period we're in historically and politically is one that requires really new thinking. And we need to break whatever self-satisfied patterns we have created. They might be working in one way, they are definitely not working in many other ways. So how can we do better is actually the question.
So just in answer to that, as a small kind of, I don't know, a small example of something that is very different from anything I've ever experienced in TV, is that I got to work on this project that we called The Hive. It was an initiative, and it was made with public service broadcaster money. It was made with film council money, film festival money, and arts council money, and it was 4 ways. So the risk was split 4 ways, and what we did was we said, we're not going to have any documentary filmmakers. They're going to be other people from the arts, so choreographers, writers, theatre directors, anyone who kind of had a creative bent, who wanted to tell a story in their way, and we let them do it, and we commissioned, every year we commissioned 2 or 3 films, depending on how big people's budgets were, knowing that this was going to be a massive, massive risk, and some of them were just spectacular failures. But some of them were the best things I've ever seen, and they broke new ground. They explored form. They weren't kind of the traditional ways of storytelling, because some of them were, but some of them weren't. Like the ones made by the choreographers weren't, because they're choreographers and their language is different. And so that kind of thing, where there's a collaboration between different funding bodies, and the risk is not as great because you could put them out later, but we didn't. We put them out in prime time. That is the most exciting commissioning I've ever done, because it produced, it did produce these absolute turkeys, but it produced fantastic storytelling as well. And I felt that we had found new talent that had a different way of telling those stories and inspired other people. And kind of, it was shown on TV, it was shown in theatres, it was shown in festivals, it was shown in all kinds of different spaces as well. So that's just one example. And I know what you're saying. You're saying, let's talk about this in different ways and conceive of different ways of not just going down the same road every time.
I just wanted to say, in terms of what you said about, do you have to make a film about Amy to be a success? Those examples that I've given, I guess what I'm trying to demonstrate with those, the 5 biggest documentaries, is just actually sort of how difficult it is. Those are just the top films, but there's, I guess it's about sort of treating films in different ways. There's other opportunities, there's other things that we can do. I kind of like to, always sort of come away from Sheffield quite energized, and I think I guess it's about sort of treating films, creating different spaces for films. I like to sort of try and harness perhaps the energy of some of the films that we have here, and we sort of quite often show films perhaps a bit more in the way that a band touring the country or whatever. We take a film on tour with the filmmakers or perhaps the people that are featured in the film. It's definitely sort of it's definitely quite a sort of a small grassroots thing. It's perhaps even just single but hopefully very full screenings with the audience getting a chance to talk to the filmmakers or whatever, and it's I definitely think that's something that we do with a lot of different types of films. So I guess it's about just creating spaces to sort of try and be a bit more adventurous.
Well,
really,
and time as well, because we're locked into these tight little schedules with certain amounts of money, and I actually think the Europeans are much better at finding other forms and supporting other types of filmmaking than the Americans are. You know, the Americans are the most traditional storytellers, I think, you know, in terms of, you know, it's very hard to even show films with subtitles in America.
I'm going to throw it to the audience in a minute, but I might just try and draw a few threads together and ask one more question of the panel. The conversation has very much been so far centered around audience and the obligation of gatekeepers, whether you guys be commissioners or programmers, an obligation to serve an audience. Barbara, you made a comment that there was a documentary commission that only had an audience of like 50,000 people, and you raised the question, was that public money well spent? And Chris, maybe unfairly, I asked you about you personally being risk averse or not, because you work for a commercial entity that has to, when you're allocating screens to a particular type of films, you're working for a company here, and that's the context in which you're doing your job. And interpreter Alisa and Brett are sort of suggesting that non-traditional forms of documentary need to be given space in a broader political context because of the link between form and the politics of what's being said. And so, just one more question for our gatekeepers on the panel is kind of, you know, you've
Stop calling us gatekeepers.
Okay, what term would you prefer?
The bad guys.
Bad guys. No, I believe you all when Chris says we're trying to make spaces, and Mandy, you're trying to say you're push, and you're trying to say you're trying to do this. I just think it would be interesting to ask you sort of how you feel personally within your really interesting roles about preserving audiences that reflect a sort of status quo and pushing audiences in new directions. And because I feel like these guys, Brett and Alisa, have sort of thrown it back on you instead of saying you bear some responsibility for what audiences are looking at, and that's elevated given the political significance of media and film. And so just kind of how do you feel sort of within your roles personally about this frisson between what you want to do personally, politically, philosophically, conceptually, and the confines of what, like you said before, being a public service broadcaster that does have an existing audience that you have metrics and data on to serve, and Chris as well, to shareholders basically. But maybe just one last round of comments from you guys, and then we'll invite you guys to ask some questions or make short comments if you wish. But do you want to go first, Chris?
Damn it. I don't know, it's a tricky one. I mean, yes.
It's a huge question, I'm so sorry.
I mean, yes, you know, bottom line is key, I guess. You know, the cinemas have to make money, otherwise they, you know, somebody starts asking questions and they get shut down. I guess I kind of see my job is definitely sort of straddling the two, really. It's kind of the making sure that the cinema is profitable, but I feel like a big part of that is making sure that it's as you know, diverse and interesting a program as possible that's bringing in new audiences. It's definitely a difficult balance. Yeah, I don't know. I'm running out of steam on that one.
It's all right. Would you guys like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I see it as my job to try and push the boundaries as much as possible. And, you know, I'm surrounded by people who are constantly saying, well, Mandy, that didn't do very well last night, or, you know, and it's not, that doesn't get me down or stop me, because I'm a bomb thrower. But it's hard within those institutions that you work within, because there are, you know, because they are traditional institutions that have these legacies and have these ways of doing things, and success breeds success, so people want to do the same thing again. And I'm not like that. I want to try different things all the time. And, you know, it's not like I can be doing that every day. It's not like every single thing I'm doing is kind of radical and out there. It's like you get one through every so often, and it's a small victory. But you know, if If people come to it or people comment, even if one person says, I saw that last night and it was great, it does have a ripple effect. So you know, I think the kind of people who commission feature docs are quite different from the rest of TV. And you know, I remember Penny Baker once said to me, you know, most of it, Mandy, is just TV fodder. And it's true. I mean, I hate to say it, but it's true. I mean, it's like religion. It's fodder for the masses, and you know, there's a certain amount of churn that goes on within our industry, and it's not just television programs. It's movies as well. It's all sorts of commercial entertainment. So from my perspective, you know, I do want to do something different. I do want to make a difference. I do want to be distinctive, and I'm always looking for different voices. And, you know, sometimes I do need reminding that, you know, maybe I'm not going far enough, or, you know, there's other ways of doing things. I mean, I'm always hamstrung by money on Storyville, but money isn't everything, you know, in terms of the kinds of program making that you're curating or deciding that you're going to put money into.
Our tagline for our signature is we want urgent and relevant documentaries that are free in spirit and look for the boundaries either in form, tone, style, or authorship. That's what our signature is. So whether that's prime time, it needs to reach a bigger audience, or whether it's late night where it can go wild, that's what I'm looking for always. And I quite often get to hear from colleagues, oh, that was a fantastic documentary, that was so risky, that's so amazing that you can air that, we could never do this. I can't do anything about it, so I'm actually quite free to do what I want, but I actually want to turn it around, because I don't think, I think our issue is really, where is the audience that wants to see your film the whole time? Where are they? Because I want to find them too. I need to find them too. And I think that's a lot more an issue, like how can we reach these people? Then, and I'm not saying that I'm doing my job very well, because obviously there's an issue, but I think it's not just the gatekeepers who need to find it. We need to find a language together that people are willing to see this, or a place for it. But as you all know, most of documentaries are financed by TV, so it needs to have a relevance to TV. It needs to have a rhythm for TV to work. It's not, I never got this job. And I mean, if you ask me, like personally, I thought when I've been in this industry for about 25 years now, longer on the not gatekeeper bad guys side. I've been producing and financing documentaries before, and selling documentaries. I've been having so many people say no to me, that now that I'm in a position to say yes, I also really realize what it means if I say no, because I've been hearing no's a lot longer than I could be saying yes. So, but for me, it's really about how can we make this a dialogue of doing it together? It's not one side against the other. It should be all of us thinking, how can we make this smarter?
I think in that respect, it does sort of sometimes feel like perhaps, you know, TV, online, cinema, you know, festivals, perhaps, you know, we might all be working independently on the same film, and that doesn't necessarily feel useful. Some of the sort of the most, you know, rewarding experiences, both just in terms of showing something interesting, but also getting an audience. You know, it is important to get an audience. It's a sort of perhaps when, you know, all of those things can be combined to kind of create the noise that gets the film, you know, to the attention of the audience and brings the audience in, however they're watching it, whether it's, you know, in you know, my cinema or on your TV screen or on the online release, you know, at the same time or later or whatever. So, yeah, working together would definitely be useful, I think.
Cool. We have some time to invite the audience to be part of this conversation as well. I invite anyone to make a question to the panel, but also if you'd like to make a comment or an observation, that's totally fine as well, but I think if we can limit it to no more than a minute, then we can make sure it's democratic and everybody can talk. But I know we've been having issues with microphones, but I'm going to hand the mic to the first person up here, and if anyone else wants to ask a question, please raise your hand and my colleagues can help out.
Thanks.
There's 2 mics here.
Yeah. Do they work?
Yes.
Oops.
I think this whole debate starts and ends with the filmmakers. I mean, I think you had it right when you said you've all got to work together. But I think the filmmaker is the person making the film. The filmmaker is also responsible, therefore, for making sure that the film gets to whatever audience the film is aiming to get at. And the filmmaker has to ask themselves, well, why am I making this film? That's my comment.
Oh, is it me? Hello. My name is Sheila Heyman, and I hear what you're saying about the difficulty of getting millennials to stay in one place and watch anything for more than 5 minutes. One place where you can kind of trap them is in universities and places like that. I just showed a bit of the film I'm making at the moment in Phoenix at a conference, and I was completely besieged afterwards by people saying, when can I show this to my students? You know, this is a really important, I mean, it is a very big subject, but, you know, people really welcoming the opportunity of something that was a bit unusual, that they could actually start a conversation amongst their university students. And I just wanted to ask particularly Chris, but other people, about working together with educational establishments and other places like that, you know, not making some kind of fusty, didactic thing, but a film that's, you know, genuinely cinematic, but has a conversation that you know, people are interested in engaging in. And anyway, you know, when you talked about taking your show on the road, whether you take it to places like that as well, or just to sort of interest groups.
I definitely think that's kind of a key part of the marketing in the right city. You know, it's sort of whenever we take a film out in that way, then yeah, you know, it's kind of finding whatever groups might be interested. I mean, it can be tough with university students as well. I know in some locations we've worked, you know, not necessarily in terms of sort of the documentary tours that I'm talking about, but we have in the past perhaps sort of put programs together with film departments of universities, and you know, 5 people turn up. So
yeah,
it's
I'm not talking about film departments really.
Well, yeah, okay. But in that respect, you know, I don't know. Students can certainly be hard to engage with, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it's. I guess we sort of look at all aspects of the audience that we think that we can reach, right. And I guess that's that's where the hard work is with some of these films. It's kind of putting in that kind of grassroots work. You know, the calling up, the meeting, the you know, getting people engaged in some way so that they're perhaps talking to their peer group about the film and encouraging other people to come along or whatever. So yeah, I mean, it's all part of it.
Okay. We in the Netherlands do something which meetups. It has to be with a film that there's something to talk about, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense. So what we do is we come up, or the filmmakers come up with a few questions or discussion items you can talk about after the film. And these meetups we started out in 3 big cities, and now we have 96 meetups all through the Netherlands, and people can just get the questions online and even get the film online and watch it in a bar. I don't mind where they watch it. And they have questions so they can talk amongst themselves. So we've got these local meetups going on now. And it's really very successful because people love to talk together about films. So, but the interesting thing is, if you were talking about, like, we need to think of, very terrible word, multi-stakeholder solutions, that all the stakeholders are happy. And what we see is we air it on TV, and then afterwards we have all these meetups. So people don't care that it's been on television already. They're perfectly happy to see it again with a group of people. So we need to think differently on how do you reach these audiences. It doesn't always have to be endless in the cinema first with windows. You need to sort of like think like, how can we make it work for everyone? And maybe TV should go first and then it should go in cinema. You can turn it around. Why should we always do the same? So these meetups people were coming up to us saying, we want to show this film and discuss about it. And we never asked them to do that. They did it themselves. And now it's a whole network. So maybe that's something you can do.
Yeah, hi. You know, and it's so difficult making films. And I think what we do at our best as filmmakers is we expose truths that are left hidden. And when I think about that, I think about films like Blackfish that made such a monumental change. We did a documentary called Sled Dogs for CBC, and now it's in the States, and exposed the sled dog industry and the cruelty that's inherent within the industry and what it does to the dogs. And you know, we made that film hopefully to add the industry, to bring awareness of what really goes on, you know, behind the scenes of happy dogs pulling sleds, and the brutality that is really the reality of it. And what's come about it is, you know, we had a social media campaign as well, and what's come from making that film is that now the biggest sled dog industry, biggest sled dog kennel in Ontario has now closed, and the Iditarod is going downhill. And I think that, you know, as a filmmaker, there's things that we want to say because we want the world to know. And if we can do films that bring about change, that bring about awareness, that's the best we can do as filmmakers, and that's a lot.
Hi. I recently just got a commission from BBC Scotland, and basically the process that I went through when we had the initial meeting, that we really had to flesh out what the story was going to be for a 60-minute doc. And essentially what happened was that the documentary is about a female boxer who's trying to go for a world championship, but then again they get sidelined because she's in a same-sex relationship and her wife has a baby. So kind of the story took a different avenue that we never seen. So what we went back to the BBC and said that, well, maybe this could be a two-parter. And essentially what we were told, well, yeah, we're interested, but we really have to flesh out what the story would be in part 1 and part 2, A, B, and C, every single scene with bullets, exactly what it's going to be. And I didn't have a problem with that because obviously they need to know what the story was in order to give us money to do that. And I guess for me, if I'd went in and I'd said it was going to be this abstract thing and I didn't really know what the story was, that not only would I have not got the commission for the second part, that I wouldn't have got the commission for the first part. So I guess for me, that somebody that's just recently came into the industry, it's only my second commission for BBC Scotland, that if I wasn't willing to do that and the production company hadn't done that, the cold hard truth of it for me is essentially I'd be back to filming weddings on a Saturday, really. I mean, that's the cold hard truth of it, eh? So I don't see the problem with like the so-called problem like the gatekeepers being focusing on story, because at the end of the day, really, you're talking about people watching something on a TV. And it's not documentary filmmakers that are going to be watching it. It's not going to be people that comes to the Sheffield Doc Fest. It's going to be people out in the streets. So I don't see the problem with that. And as an academic exercise, I think the beyond story thing is quite interesting. But again, to me, as like sort of someone that's just breaking into the industry, it feels a bit irrelevant, really. So it's just my take on it.
Mm-hmm. Can I just, sorry, I know there's lots of people that want to speak, but I do think we need to, you know, talk a little bit about what we mean when we say audience. And, you know, I appreciate that that's why you make films, the person who's just describing the Canadian film about sled dogs. But and that might be a reason that I make some of my films, but I also make films to invite people to think with me about hard questions about the world. And I don't think audiences are too lazy or stupid to do that. And in fact, I am an audience member. I grew up working class, and I gravitate towards films that respect me and appreciate that I don't mind thinking for myself and thinking with a filmmaker who has intention and vision and is exploring the world and asking questions that have stakes to them and is wanting and inviting an audience to do that alongside them. And I think that there should be room for those types of films. I don't think we would disagree. You know, I think we would all suggest that. So I just think we have to be careful when we reduce the audience to a sort of like, I don't know, sometimes I hear people talking about audience and I'm imagining these sort of like, you know, totally zoned out like zombies I think that that's a failure on our part to think that those are the people who are watching television at the end of the night, or going to cinemas, or streaming stuff on their computer.
I mean, but I think what all of us, I mean, amazing how many people are in the room coming to listen to this subject, and what the discussion here and the discussion out there proves is that there are different audiences, there are different platforms. It's very, very diverse. You know, that's the beauty of documentaries. That, you know, in more than any other form, I think, you know, that is what makes them very special. And it's about having an understanding and appreciation of you know, the kind of filmmakers who make documentaries like Brett does, or the mainstream stuff. And we've all bring our own baggage to it and our own personal taste to it. But it's about kind of understanding and listening, and I mean, just an understanding of the history of documentaries, which, you know, there's a lot of people in this industry who don't know about the history of documentary filmmaking. I'll say to a young filmmaker, have you seen this film? I say, no, I've never seen this film. And it's like, you have to understand, to understand the present, you have to understand the past. And it's, you know, the range of incredible films that have been made going way back to Man with a Movie Camera, to quote one of the films that you think is great, and I do too. You know, delve into the past and see what's been made before, and you'll see the incredible range. And, you know, also I'll get people saying to me, I've got this great idea. It's like, it's so out there, it's so radical. It's like, yeah, that was made 30 years ago. It'll be made in a different way, but, you know, it's still, it's good to explore the past to understand the present and where we've come since then, because technology is an amazing thing. You know, like, I made a film about the handheld sync sound camera, and before that, cameras were on tripods. They were too heavy to carry around, so there was no handheld, there was no observational filmmaking. There were wind-up cameras that lasted 30 seconds, and then you had to wind them up again. You know, so VR has enabled us to find a different form of storytelling, which is incredible. And, you know, like, I went to the VR thing at Sundance, and it just blew my mind. I felt like I was having some kind of existential trip. And it was fantastic. But, you know, that still hasn't found a kind of mainstream platform. It's still at festivals, and BBC's got a VR department, but we haven't really, you know, it's still very experimental, the way that we're commissioning those VR films, and because they haven't got much money either. But we know that is a future technology that has a lot of power, and so we're still exploring the range and how we find the audience for that new form.
Got time for like one or two more comments or questions to the audience before we wrap up. Over there.
Yeah, I just want to address this to Alisa, and maybe it's a little zooming out one kind of level, but someone mentioned giving audiences what they want, which I think is like it's a kind of conceptualization of supply and demand that maybe abdicates responsibility a little bit on behalf of especially broadcasters in their role in influencing and defining what is wanted by audiences, because people are creatures of habit. So the more you show of certain kinds of things, the more people become accustomed to things, especially when it comes to story, which is founded on convention. So I'm quite interested in asking Alisa to speak to what kind of responsibility broadcasters have in creating spaces for experimentation, especially in light of the kind of decline of democracy and climate change and kind of the running out of narrative that we have kind of reached at this point in history. So how do we create it? Do you feel like there's a responsibility on the behalf of broadcasters, especially in creating space where people can be exposed to other sort of other senses of consequence, basically, if you know what I mean?
Yeah. I want to just say, we do that. But if, you know, I never realized when I got into this job how it would be, because I get about 1,000 projects a year sent to me, and I only have 20 spots. So you need to then think like, okay, I can't just say to the first 20 of the year, yeah, I'll take them, and then just do nothing for the rest of the year. So we come up with these ideas of what are the priorities. So young talent is one of my priorities, and I look in my schedule all the time, like, do I have enough young talent? Yeah, I can do one more, great. And the same with innovative storytelling or experimental form, that's also one of my priorities. So within these 20 films I can do a year, then 5 need to be young talent, 5 need to be innovative storytelling, and 10 need to be fucking prime time. So that's what I do. But for me, I really need to do it that way because I've got 1,000 projects a year coming my way. So, and quite often I see with the projects that are coming my way that they don't have a clue who we are or what we do. The amount of times that I get emails saying, "Hi Barbie," and I'm like, "Barbie? That's not my name." Or, "Hi Mandy." I was like, "Oh, you just sent this email to Mandy and you forgot to change the name." Or, "I've got this fantastic 3-part series about sharks." I mean, for me, it's also about, like, if you want us to do our job seriously, you need to be serious about what we do as well. Then you need to sort of look into the people you send an email to, like, is this actually something that they put on, you know, or isn't it? Because it doesn't make sense to send me Barbie emails about sharks, you know, it really, but I'm not going to respond to it either because I can spend my time more wisely. If you do not take us seriously, then why should I take you? So think about that. If you want to have financing from a broadcaster, then you need to bring something to the broadcaster that makes sense for them to sort of think like, yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I actually think that, thank you so much for that question, which is actually more of a comment and already has its own answer built into it. So I probably don't need to add that much. But I did want to say that, I mean, no matter how sophisticated our metrics are about audience, audience is still an abstraction and an illusion. And it's also something that we can create or we can encourage. And part of that is precisely a kind of a visionary position and recognizing the responsibility of that position. So I think it's really interesting, you know, you didn't realize what you were getting into when you got into it. I think many programmers don't know their documentary history. Many, you know, people in the industry who are in these gatekeeping positions maybe don't actually quite get the position they're in, the responsibility that they have, and also vis-a-vis creating audiences and creating kind of tastes, and you are the tastemakers, actually.
I think lots of us do.
No, I'm not saying you in particular, but I've run into, you know, curators, programmers at festivals, asked them what films they like. I could predict which films they liked. I could predict which films they would program, and I could ask them questions exactly as you've done to filmmakers, to programmers, and curators, if they knew the film that had been made 30 years before that was just like it, and of course they didn't. I mean, I agree completely.
But again, I do think public service broadcasters take much more responsibility than the commercial ones because for the commercial ones, the commercial imperative is the main thing, whereas we don't.
Sorry, go ahead.
We don't. It's not the same. It's not the same imperative. We don't have to make money. I mean, that's the beauty of what I do. I don't have to make money.
And then we have the same logic. I work for a public institution as well. University is still public, for more or less, and yet, you know, the first person we heard talk about risk aversion was Mandy, and I have the same. I encounter the same corporate rhetoric at the university level. We are encouraged to think in terms of this particular bottom line when actually that is not our responsibility. We have other responsibilities to attend to, and I think it is time to step up, all of us, at university as well, in public broadcasting as well, and really say, actually, this is not the only logic, and we have other much more pressing issues to attend to.
We have time for one more comment from the audience. The gentleman with the mic.
And he's very furious too. So.
Okay. Let's do two, but really quick.
Just wanted to ask: isn't story inevitable? It's like as soon as you point a camera at something, as soon as you put two shots together, there are questions that arise, and you know is the space we should be talking about the audience's head. It's like Andrew Stanton in his TED talk, he said, you know, give them 2 + 2 and they'll make 4. So the action's there, in there. Is that the space that we should be looking at as opposed to where we show things? Or, you know?
I might jump in and address that one because we're limited for time, but I think, yeah, absolutely, we can explore what is story, what is narrative, what is non-narrative. I guess the way we're defining story for the sake of this conversation, the parameters of it were like limited number, a film that has a limited number of central characters that is hinged around some kind of conflict resolution.
So the hero's journey, basically.
Pardon me?
Hero's journey, basically.
A narrative arc, yeah. And so definitely there's more to unpack about a film that doesn't look like that, but maybe in a broader, zoomed out context has story for sure. Last question from the audience, and then I'm going to invite the panel to comment one last time if anyone wants to, but go ahead.
Hi, I'm Tom Randall. I make Panorama for the BBC, I think there's an interesting big point here about public interest and what the public is interested in. And it occurs to me that the BBC has a lot of money, and Panorama don't give me much of it, and they don't give you enough of it. And where else should it be? Where else should the BBC be spending money than on Panorama and on Mandy Chang's Storyville? I mean, these are the proper things they should be doing. The cash is going to the wrong places. And I tell you what, a point about democracy: if you do a referendum on public hanging, it'll probably come back. Or, you know, any other referendum that might have a terrible consequence.
Thanks for that comment. That's okay. We've covered a lot of ground here, and it feels fairly neat and tidy. But if anyone else on the panel wanted to just do one final comment, I would invite you.
I just want to say one thing about Brett's films, because I do think they are linear. I mean, they have a structure within them, which is you know, it takes place over a summer. It's a time frame, which is a classic device of documentaries. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think it's a really good thing, because you know that you're going from the beginning of the summer to the end of the, even if that's not the order in which you filmed it.
Thank you. I mean, I also think my films are, I mean, this is why I sort of buff up against the sort of category of experimentation, because it suggests that there's something that's normal and then something that's deviant, and I think that there's lots of different ways to organize people and scenes. I just also wanted to say that I really appreciated some of the honesty on this panel around institutional pressure, because I don't think that we're talking about you and your individual tastes and your gatekeeper or you're not gatekeeper and this or that. I think to this last comment, we need to take seriously what's happening to our institutions. I come from a country with a public broadcaster like the CBC that's just been defunded for 20 years. And so that produces a set of institutional pressures that then get downloaded on people who want to do more than they can. And the reality of amazing art house theaters closing because audiences aren't coming is real. And so I think that that's part of what the conversation needs to be about, is sort of thinking about the institutional pressures that are resulting in certain consensus that then do a disservice to audiences and makers alike.
Great.
I just wanted to encourage people, I don't know if this is on, to actually go to the manifesto and give your response. We actually want to hear from you, and it will be kind of corralled. We're doing a special issue specifically on the Beyond story that'll be coming out, I think, less than a year from now, or a year from now, or something like this. So bring your voices to this conversation.
Yeah, and the link to the manifesto is on the website of Sheffield DocFest under this event. There should be a hyperlink. If everybody's good, I just want to firstly begin by saying huge thanks to you guys for coming out for this conversation and being part of the audience and listening. As you've seen that huge, thick program guide in your delegate bags, there's so much going on right now, and that we'd really like you to be talking to other people that you're meeting in the festival about the conversations that happened today. This conversation shouldn't be limited to what went on in this room. Sheffield DocFest is a place for conversations for the industry, about the industry, with you guys as filmmakers, film lovers, whatever. So please continue this conversation in the queues for the cinemas, in the pubs, at the parties later, and beyond, and online and wherever, and as Alisa said, contribute to the manifesto. And really refreshed to see so many of you here today. I really thank you. I think Chris made a comment about coming to DocFest and feeling energized about the, forcing you to think deeply about what it is we're doing here, and that's been the intention of today's session, to think deeply about what we're all doing in our various roles as programmers, as critical academics, and as filmmakers, and as commissioners. So thanks to you guys for coming and being part of that, and just really huge thanks to Chris, to Alisa, to Brett, to Mandy, to Barbara for giving up their time today, and like Brett said, the honesty and sincerity of this conversation, not only for this time now, but also for the preparation that went into it all. A round of applause for our panel, please. Thank you.